when I say get total calories right, I'm not talking about counting calories by the calorie and logging everything within an app, but maintaining a set of habits that reflects the reality of whether or not you're overeating or undereating.
Yeah, I'm pumped to talk about this revolutionary new way to approach dieting and fat loss. Flexible dieting. It's not a concept that I'm familiar with. So what is flexible dieting?
Flexible dieting is widely misconstrued as counting macros. And it's also widely misconstrued as filling in those macros with whatever foods as long as you hit the macros. So that's what it's misconstrued as. But what it actually is, it is an approach to dieting. So it is a cognitive style of dietary restraint or dietary control. So flexible dietary control doesn't approach diets and foods in a dichotomous black-white, good-evil light. It doesn't look at dieting as an all-or-nothing endeavor. And so therefore, it's highly ironic when flexible dieting is automatically conflated with meticulously counting macros. That's under the umbrella of the flexibility of dietary approach. So I guess to simplify the whole thing, flexible dieting really is the individualization of the dietary approach. Some people prefer a more granular and quantitative approach. Others prefer a more habits-based, a little bit more loose, qualitative approach. Eat more of this stuff, less of that stuff. And it's all under the umbrella of flexible dieting because people succeed in different ways that are unique to their own proclivities, their own preferences, tolerances, and goals. And so it really is about individualization. And as you and I were discussing earlier, this book, it's far more than a dieting book, right?
Yeah, way more.
Yeah. It's basically titled Flexible Dieting, but I pretty much put everything in there about non-clinical nutrition. Everything from just how to set up nutritional targets, how to set up energy and macronutrition targets for various goals, fat loss, muscle gain, athletic performance, and also how to set up the diet to alter or rather bolster adherence. Well, there are aspects of diet that enhance endurance, and that's covered in the book as well. But a big part of the book is how can we create a dietary approach? How can we individualize it so that the individual actually sticks to it? And what I've observed in just multiple decades of this stuff is that some people love more rigid, more quantitative approaches, and some people love more qualitative approaches. But the unifying thing amongst all the approaches is that nutrition is nutrition. The macronutrients are going to be the macronutrients. Food selection is always going to be on a spectrum of high quality to pure crap. And how do we navigate that? How do we set it up so that the person can sustain a mostly high quality diet? And so, yeah, that all kinds of stuff. All kinds of stuff in the book.
No, it's amazing. I mean, it's like it's a manual for reading and understanding and assimilating science, which I think is so important. Because science literacy, it's like one of these things that we've outsourced, right? Like there's this misconception that to think scientifically, you have to have earned a PhD or an MD. But actually, you offer tools in the book that anybody can take and integrate into their own lives.
Yeah, it's something that I just couldn't help but include in the book. My hope and my aim is to teach people how to fish as much as I can within reason. And I realize that that initial section of the book can be a little bit heavy when I'm talking about the different types of research and what is this concept of evidence? You know, what does it mean to be evidence-based? Explaining that is kind of a process, and it was difficult to make it simple enough, but thorough enough to cover all of the necessary points and equip people with all of the necessary bits of knowledge and skills to become, at least foundationally, scientifically literate to the point where at least they're asking the right questions when they hear a given claim about a certain diet or a certain protocol, in whatever realm of fitness, whether it be diet, supplementation, exercise, that sort of thing. People should have an idea of what is mostly speculative and interesting and worthy of a lot more investigation versus stuff that has an abundance of support, has a convergence of evidence from multiple lines of evidence, lots of replication, so that we kind of know, yeah, that's pretty much how it is. And there's only perhaps a small margin more left that we need to investigate about that. But this is what we know versus this is what we're speculating. So I think that's important to navigate the landscape and the minefield of internet-based information and all just the waves of all kinds of information that people get.
Yeah, it's so important. It helps you navigate the path of least uncertainty in life, in anything, in all regards.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. I mean, that's something that I want for all of my listeners and viewers. So you mentioned dichotomous thinking, rigid dieting. Actually, you open the book with some mind-blowing facts about how an overly rigid mindset when it comes to dieting can actually lead to worse outcomes, like lower success with regard to a diet. So what can you give us some examples of like dichotomous thinking and what the potential consequences of that mindset could be?
Sure. A classically rigid model of dieting would be, here's your diet. Like it's a one-page menu, meal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And each meal is boiled chicken breast, brown rice or sweet potato, plus some asparagus and 8 almonds. Okay. So you have 6 meals of that.
Right.
And then for your final meal, maybe have like some protein fluff with stevia if you've been a good boy for the day. There you go. That's your diet.
Right.
So that would be an extreme form of rigidity where you just have a literal script that you have to stick to from, I don't know, for however long you can stand it. Okay, so that's one end of the spectrum. The other,
and that would potentially work, right? I mean, like that could work for a day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, but
it can work for a whole contest prep, and it does. And so there's times and places for things like that. But when we're talking about the general public, which the original flexible dieting research was based on, and what the majority of them can sustain and what they can't, it turns out that the general public does not necessarily do well, or at least the majority of them don't do well, on rigid or dichotomous approaches to diet where you either do the diet perfectly or you failed. Another example of rigid dieting is, here are your narrow set of foods, your 6 foods. I'm gonna evoke my Pulcinella for a second. The 6 foods that work. And so that would be a rigid model. Okay. Just a very, very strict parameters on food selection. Like you can only have these kinds of fruit, only have berries, because heaven forbid you choose, like, let's say the other fruits that have a higher glycemic load, right? Another approach to rigidity would be, right, so you have these protein sources, but some of these have certain constituents within them that are known to be associated with X, Y, and Z disease. So no, can't have that.
Right.
Yeah, that's rigidity. And speaking of macros, another form of rigid dieting would encompass very strict macronutrient targets, where if you had to hit, let's say 120 grams of protein in a day and you hit like 100 or 110, oh, whoops, you failed.
Right.
So that's rigid dieting, is either a script or an all or nothing approach to dieting or failing the diet, or just an all or nothing black-white view of foods, evil foods, superfoods, that sort of thing. There's no gray scale. And that would be some of the aspects of rigid dieting.
What about like diet? How do you reconcile this approach with like diet preferences, like people that really like and can sustain very like low carb diets, for example,
Mhm.
or like diets that are very low and that are mindful of the added sugar content.
Mhm.
You know, like dietary preferences that might seem from the outside as rigid or extreme.
Okay. So just kind of taking a step back, rigid dieting would say everybody must adhere to this type of macronutrient breakdown. Everybody must adhere to, let's take I guess the 90s bodybuilding and fitness diet, which was 40% protein, 40% carbs, 20% fat. You know what I'm saying? So um, everybody's got to adhere to that. That's rigidity.
Hmm.
But flexible dieting would say get your protein within the ballpark. And if you're somebody who prefers low carb or very low carb or ketogenic, have at it, Hoss.
Yeah. So it's basically just saying that there's not one way up the mountain. There are many ways up the mountain.
Yeah.
And you've got to find and you are allowed to find the one that works best for you. That's going to be the easiest to sustain for you.
Yes, and there's nuances, of course. Like certain there are relatively non-negotiables or less negotiables, and then highly negotiables. So the less negotiables would be getting your protein and your total energy intake right, in whichever way you decide to do that.
Okay, so break that down. Total energy intake, meaning the amount of calories.
Total calories. Yeah. Yeah. And the way that you know you're getting your total calories right is if your body composition is what you want it to be or is progressing towards what you want it to be. And you're feeling good and you're performing the way you want to perform if that's part of your goal. So when I say get total calories right, I'm not talking about counting calories by the calorie and logging everything within an app, but maintaining a set of habits that reflects the reality of whether or not you're overeating or undereating.
Got it.
And so yeah, if somebody loves high carb, low fat, great, go for it. Just what's less negotiable is really, are you getting enough protein? Than the other stuff. Carbs and fat, it's kind of whatever, man. It's like you can go any proportion of carb and fat that fits your personal preference, your individual tolerance, and any sort of performance goals that you may or may not have. So let's imagine somebody has competitive athletic performance goals. Well, naturally going keto would be a risk, regardless of whether they nailed their protein perfectly and had this lovely selection of foods that constituted a very high dietary quality.
Yeah.
They'd still be missing the point.
And is that because carbohydrates are consuming carbohydrates is more optimal for athletic performance?
That's right. Yeah. Undercarbing for athletic performance, whether it be strength or whether it be endurance or whether it be any point in between, is a risk. And it's a higher risk at the higher levels that you go. The higher the stakes, the higher the risk of undercarbing. The higher the cost of undercarbing.
Yeah, because you need carbs, you need stored glycogen, right, to fuel your high intensity anaerobic exercise, right?
Indeed.
Or athleticism, whatever that happens to be.
Yep, you sure do. And there's a series of studies by Louise Burke and colleagues that show that even with the lower intensity stuff, the lower intensity, linear, lower, moderate intensity race walking, even that gets affected by keto versus conventional high carb. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Tightly controlled experiments, matching total calories and importantly, protein as well between the groups that are being compared. And yeah, the keto group tends to tank compared to the high carb control group.
Got it. So depending on your goals, if athleticism is of import to you, then you definitely don't want to be doing a super, super low carb.
Right. And I have to emphasize the higher the stakes, then the higher the risk and the cost. So if you're just wanting to perform recreationally, and there's no major competitive stakes, if you just want to, let's say, look good at the family reunion, or you want to look decent at the pool or the beach or whatever, then really carbs, fat proportion, personalize it as you want. But once competitive athletics comes into the picture and the stakes are high, then undercarbing is definitely a risk.
Got it. But so for the average person, it really doesn't matter the proportion of
That's right.
carbs and fat
That's right.
in your diet.
Mm-hmm.
Which
can I add a little wrinkle in there?
Yeah.
If this person we're talking about has type 2 diabetes, then you can potentially expedite the alleviation of that condition if you restrict carbs.
Got it.
And statistically, it's about 130 grams a day and lower that the restoration of a normal glycemia can occur.
Wow.
So there are, little clinical nuances to consider here. But even when you're looking at that research, when you're looking at the long term, I'm talking like 1 year and beyond, really the main thing with alleviating type 2 diabetes or sending it into remission is really a lot of weight loss. Any which way but loose, whether it's a higher proportion of carbs or a lower proportion of carbs. It's really just a matter of imposing a pretty aggressive caloric deficit, and the loss of body fat needs to happen. And that's how it's affected, kind of regardless of macronutrient composition.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Isn't there a debate within the sort of nutrition space about what causes insulin resistance, with some arguing that it's just a state of of too much energy, and then others arguing that it's chronic pounding of the insulin receptor with whether or not you're in a hyper energetic state. Did I characterize that debate?
Yeah, absolutely. Certain things make sound biologically plausible, and some things make. I guess if I were to paraphrase John Berardi, some things make logical sense, but not necessarily biological sense. So the pounding of like, let's say the whole beta cell system. I mean, on paper, you could say that, yes, if we chronically stimulate that system and exhaust the faculties of that system, then we can cause insulin resistance. But it's very tough to disentangle the intake of excess total energy from that phenomenon.
Got it.
It's very difficult to do. And if we didn't have just a battery of studies showing a very wide range of carbohydrates within the diet being equally effective for alleviating insulin resistance, once the total energy is at a net deficit over time, then that hypothesis would be a lot stronger. And then we would be able to concentrate more on maybe pointing the finger at carbohydrate. There's a line of research by Jeff Volek and his colleagues doing the Virta Health program. And that has shown some pretty stunning success for pre-diabetics and type 2 diabetics. And it's based on the ketogenic model. And the ketogenic model, on paper, it's ideal for type 2 diabetics. And the Virta research tends to support that pretty strongly. But also the Virta research, or the Virta program, involves constant 24/7 a link to a medical team. So constant medical monitoring. And you're also linked to a community, an online community. And you also have a personal coach. So you have the medical staff, the community, and the personal coach on tap, on speed dial. And you're paying $400-ish a month for it, or your insurance.
That's a lot. So it's a ketogenic diet, but is it also a hypocaloric diet? Meaning, they're also losing weight? Right.
Yes. And adherence is bolstered by those factors that I mentioned. So Virta is not the same as going keto. And the thing about keto, I have nothing against it. I mean, gosh, there are certain days where I'm ketoing a lot of the time because I'm just sitting around and I don't necessarily have the need for a lot of carbohydrate. And I love meat and I love fat, and I don't necessarily love the high carb stuff. Technically I love everything. I'll eat anything that doesn't eat me first, but But interestingly, very interestingly, the majority of the general population who's not on Virta and doesn't have that sort of support system, they can't sustain keto for the long term.
It's a difficult diet. Yeah.
They start off, they're assigned 50 grams of, metabolizable carb or less per day. You're assigned that at the beginning. And by the 12-month mark in the majority of studies and with the majority of subjects, it's triple. It's like $1.50 by the end of the year. People just can't stick with that 50 and over. Now there is a subset of the general population who totally can, totally love it, and they do great. But interestingly, they're in the minority.
Yeah, and I think also if you were to recommend the ketogenic diet for everybody on a wide scale, you'd end up with a lot of people just doing it wrong, like doing it in a way. I mean, I guess it's the ketogenic diet can be done regardless of. You can do sort of like a clean keto, and I'm using air quotes, and dirty keto, again using air quotes. But like what I mean is that there are some people that will do keto where it's just all bacon and blocks of cheese and eschewing any low carbohydrate plant material because they're essentially getting the free pass to eat all the bacon that they want and have all the butter that they want. And then the minority probably would do keto in a way that actually incorporates fibrous vegetables, which can play a role, which can have a some real estate on the plate in a ketogenic diet. But
carnivore guys going to get you with that, man.
No, I know
they're going to get you.
I know. I'm definitely pro. I mean, I would say that I eat a diet that's like, I don't eat keto, but I do tend to eat a lower carbohydrate Mediterranean style diet.
Me too.
Yeah.
I just love it.
Yeah. I mean, that's what works for me. Okay. So any mixture of fat or carbs, so long as you're getting your energy balance correct in accordance with your goals, right? So more.
And this is when we're talking about body composition goals.
Yeah.
As well as athletic goals. So food quality and food selection, that's kind of like a health thing. So it's a whole separate conversation.
It shouldn't be though, but it is often, I feel like.
Yeah.
Right. We gotta reconcile that, those two camps. Which I think we can. I think we can by the end of this conversation.
Sure. We'll try.
Yeah. So, okay, protein. Protein is a non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
There's far too much research showing that roughly double the RDA is the sweet spot for improving not just body composition parameters, but also clinical parameters across the full range of clinical and non-clinical populations. So yeah, we're about 40 years into when the RDA was established. And oddly, the powers that be are not changing the RDA in the official publications. And I don't know if they ever will. I don't know why they're not changing it. We can at least bump it up to like 1.2, which would represent the lower end of what shows benefit clinically and non-clinically in a range of populations. So with the general population, it's realistic to say that a healthy range is 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. There is just a mounting body of research showing that 1.6 is kind of where the magic happens. It's kind of where the magic happens, especially through points in the life cycle where you're either dieting purposefully or you're getting older and you're just not covering your bases nutritionally and you're not covering your bases physical activity wise, and just the various forces of life that descend upon people in middle age. They tend to set you up for, well, not necessarily eating enough protein. Habitual protein intakes are not 1.6 at the general population level. Yet, whenever we compare 1.6 with whatever lower amount you want, you want to pick in the literature, 1.6 almost always outdoes it for either body comp parameters or clinical parameters.
Wow, so, very interesting. So for people to figure out what that means for them, 1.6 times their Is it their body weight or their goal weight?
That's a great question. And I would say your goal or target body weight, or some people would call it ideal body weight.
Yeah.
Only because when you take into account overweight and obesity, you may be overprescribing with people on the severe end of overweight.
Got it. And this is in kilograms, by the way. I forgot to mention.
Right.
Very
So
important.
so in American terms, we'd go 0.7 grams per pound of target body weight. That's kind of the sweet spot.
Got it.
And there are fringe populations worth mentioning. Since I'm part of the bro culture, and trust me, I take one look at you, I know you have 1 foot in the bro culture. There, Max.
1 foot. 1 foot.
Maybe, it might be down to a pinky toe by now, but trust me, I know you've been there. So there are conditions where 1.6 might not be optimal. And so just observationally, all the way up to 2.4, which is a little over a gram per pound of body weight, would be ideal for the goal of maximizing muscle gain or maximizing muscle retention when you're training and you're lean.
That seems like so much protein.
A gram per pound?
I mean, I'm 190 pounds right now.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle to get 130, which is roughly, I think, for me, the 0.7
Right.
grams per pound. But 190 grams of protein. How do you get that much protein in a day?
You get in touch with your inner protein shake.
But you're digesting, you're eating and digesting food all day, probably. Like lots of protein shakes, a protein shake with every meal.
Right. So if your goal indeed is if your main goal is to maximize muscle gain, then you would kind of pull out those stops.
Got it.
But if your goal is to maintain, let's say, an average or above average, a robust amount of muscle mass, then you'll be perfectly fine at 0.7 grams per pound of target body weight. And it's a lot easier to manage than going the full gram per pound.
If you are doing 0.7, are you shortchanging the results that you could potentially be getting from your workouts?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Yeah, we're looking at populations that fit very specific parameters. The guys who do better on a gram per pound, and those guys they're lean already, but they're deciding to diet and push the envelope of leanness while training.
Is there such a thing as a hard gainer? Is this like advice for hard gainers, like people who have trouble putting on muscle?
That would apply to the fabled hard gainer.
The fabled hard gainer.
The fabled hard gainer, yes. And ironically, you wouldn't necessarily want to go too high with protein with a hard gainer, because protein it's the most satiating macronutrient. And after, once you start doing like 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, then your intake of the other macronutrients and the rest of the diet naturally goes down. So it can have this sort of a point of diminishing returns if you go too high with the protein when you're trying to help somebody gain. But yeah, with hard gainers, an interesting phenomenon with them, they usually are folks who tend to ramp up what we call, and what you're very familiar with, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or subconscious movement and unconscious movement, unconscious energy expenditure. That tends to ramp up the fidgeting,
yeah.
The moving, the bobbing the head, and all that stuff, even just muscular contraction during sleep. That all comes into play with hard gainers. Hard gainers are just resistant to gaining weight because they ramp up their non-exercise activity subconsciously when you try to impose a caloric surplus.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So if you're a hard gainer, what's the advice then? To just be more mindful of your non-exercise physical activity?
It's very tough. It's very tough because that's
you just got to eat
subconscious wiring. You just got to eat more.
And like you would say, perhaps choose foods that are more calorie dense, right?
Yeah, sneak the calories in, get the meals as reasonably big as you can, the main meals, and sneak the shakes and the calories in between, and try to cover your bases with eating upon waking and eating pre-bed. It's certain stops you got to pull out if you have certain goals as a hard gainer.
Yeah. This is so interesting. So protein really is, regardless of what dietary pattern you choose to adopt, protein is really, as you said, the non-negotiable.
That's right. 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 0.7 to 1.0 grams per pound of target body weight. It's really kind of the magic range.
What about people who say that we all nobody's walking around protein deficient, right? We all eat too much protein as it is. You look at long-lived populations, they're not drinking protein shakes. And so, I mean, that's a common rebuttal that you get sometimes on social media. So how do you answer that?
Sure. I answer it in a way that kind of gets some people mad. But if you take a look at the general Western population, then they are getting frail too early. They're beginning to show signs of frailty in middle age. They're beginning to show signs of just physical and structural decline of lean body mass at 50. I mean, dude, that's insane.
Yeah, 50, you're still young.
You're still young. I'm 50.
Yeah.
And so just knowing that there are those data, it's very it's easy to kind of rebut and say, if we were to optimize protein intakes, even before middle age, and just keep people from middle age on through older age and older age, try to optimize that and marry that with resistance training, then we wouldn't just have the archetypical Okinawans who can still squat and garden. We would have those guys, but more jacked and more vigorous and more functional.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are populations who perhaps are sub-optimizing protein, but they have so many other variables right that the lack of protein or the suboptimality of their protein intake, it doesn't necessarily impact their life expectancy. But I think that we can create, for lack of a better word, we can create super soldiers all the way up until their 70s and 80s.
I can't think of a better phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to be a super soldier.
I think we can do it.
Yeah.
I'm stronger now at 50 than I was at 25. And I sure as heck don't plan on relinquishing any of my strength as I age further, you know.
I mean, that's how it should be, right? I mean, you get more wise as you get older. Why shouldn't you get stronger?
Right.
In body.
Sure. And I have this conversation with my wife all the time. She's like, we got to just accept the fact that we're going to get old. We're going to get weaker. We're designed to get old, and we're designed to leave the planet. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. But I think we can extend the length of time that we're vigorous significantly beyond the norm, as long as certain habits are in place and as long as a certain mindset is in place. And yeah, I'm optimistic about that. So
I am too. Yeah. I love that. Does the post-workout anabolic window exist?
That's so brotacular of you to ask that.
Let's get brotacular.
Okay, so I'm going to start off in the late 80s with this, so bear with me. In the late 80s, John Ivey and his colleagues did a series of experiments taking a look at the timing of carbohydrate post-exercise and its effect on glycogen resynthesis, or the restocking of muscle glycogen. And so the way that they did that is they took overnight fasted subjects, put them through a glycogen depleting protocol, so which would be roughly 90 to 120 minutes of consistent moderate to high intensity work on the quads, cycling work. And you basically tap out glycogen in that muscle group. And then they compared the immediate administration of a substantial amount of carbohydrate right post-exercise versus delaying it by a couple hours or more. And sure enough, at like the 3-4 hour mark, if you delay your carbohydrate intake, then you have a significantly lower level of glycogen restocking in the short term. And so this is relevant to endurance athletes, especially those who have more than one competitive glycogen depleting event in a single day. And so that finding was valid for that. Okay, so now we're moving into the early 2000s, where we're looking at the effect of muscle protein synthesis, the effect of feeding amino acids and or protein post-exercise on muscle protein synthesis. And they did a bunch of permutations nutrient administration. They did amino acids by themselves. They did carbohydrate by itself. They did the combination of the two, and they did different timing schemes of that. And they basically concluded, this was in the early 2000s, with the book Nutrient Timing by John Ivey and Robert Portman, the one with the side chest shot on the cover.
Yeah, it's really
that little paperback that certain folks have. And they hypothesized that if you don't get highly glycemic, highly insulinemic carbohydrate and protein, and highly hyper amino acidemic protein source post exercise within like a 30 to 60 minute window, then you are compromising recovery and you're compromising muscle anabolism or muscle growth. So that was the hypothesis. And they focused you in on this 30 to 60 minute post-exercise anabolic window of opportunity, as it was called. And so once that book was put out and once that idea was put out there, it just caught fire amongst the fitness community. And then this major health or this major halo, okay, was just shining around this narrow post-exercise, rapidly closing window that you were supposed to grab your high glycemic carbs like dextrose, like just refined, as refined as you can get it. You want to go even further, go with Vitargo, the high molecular weight polysaccharides.
I used to slam maltodextrin, pure maltodextrin.
There you go. You get the dextrose, the maltodextrin, and then you have that with some sort of very quickly digestible protein source, usually whey or hydro whey if you really want to get fast with things. And that was a big idea for quite a while. And what happened from the early 2000s towards 2010 was that a series of studies were done comparing the placement of nutrients post-exercise at different points. And also during that time period, there were short-term experiments that compared protein by itself with protein plus carbs on muscle protein synthesis. So starting with that, and then I'll get to the longitudinal studies. So starting with these short-term studies, they found that if the protein dose was at a certain level, 20, 25 grams and up, the amount of muscle protein synthesis that was elicited by that comparison, it didn't matter whether you were combining it with carbohydrate or whether it was just protein by itself. Same level of muscle protein synthesis. And this was a novel finding at the time because prior to that, when they're only doing the equivalent of like 10 grams of protein or so, or half the amount of these later studies, they showed that when you combine it with carbohydrates, obviously it would be more insulinemic and muscle protein synthesis would be higher with the combo condition. But when you get protein high enough, same muscle protein synthesis.
With or without carbs.
With or without carbs. And that starts at 25-ish grams.
Of a protein, assuming that there's a certain amount of, like leucine?
Yes, they attribute it to leucine, like roughly 2 to 3 grams being like the leucine trigger or the leucine threshold.
Got it.
And with older folks, that threshold could be double that.
Interesting.
So yeah.
Because of what? Like anabolic resistance, I've heard?
Right. Age-related muscle anabolic resistance. And there's that whole conversation, which is a good one, by the way. And so yeah, what basically happened was we saw that in the short term, muscle protein synthesis was the same with the combo of protein and carbs versus protein by itself at about 25 grams of protein and up. And then a bunch of other studies, longitudinal studies. When I say longitudinal, I mean the non-short-term stuff, the stuff that drags out for weeks and months where you can actually measure outcomes like strength and muscle hypertrophy, body composition. So a bunch of those studies rolled out comparing the placement of protein immediately next to the workout or delayed by an hour or two. When total daily protein was about 1.6-ish or more in the comparison, no difference in muscle gains, whether you delayed the protein intake or whether you had it immediately post-exercise. And so this whole idea of the post-exercise anabolic window started falling apart as these longitudinal studies started rolling out. And what happened at that point, and a little wrinkle here, if you can bear with me, a lot of the research that seemingly supported the post-exercise anabolic window simply supplemented protein post-exercise and didn't compensate for that in the control group by adding that protein elsewhere in the day. So it was just a little bit more protein.
Got it.
In the timed conditions versus the non-timed conditions. But even in the properly designed studies where they added protein post-exercise and in the control group, they added protein far from the exercise bout. Even with those experiments, as long as the total daily protein intake was 1.6, 1.7, no difference in muscular adaptations to resistance training over time. And so my colleague Brad Schoenfeld and I, and we brought James on there because he's real great at statistics and he's a cool guy. We ran a meta-analysis. So as you know, meta-analysis is a study of the studies of the question of relevance here, which is there an anabolic window around the training bout? And so we meta-analyzed the studies that compared protein timed conditions where there was protein administration at a minimum of 20, 25-ish grams within 2 hours of either side of the training bout versus conditions that neglected protein a minimum of 2 hours on both sides of the bout. And lo and behold, as long as total daily protein intake was good, you can delay your protein intake by up to 2 hours.
Wow.
But hey, who knows? Maybe like at 3 hours, you're screwed. But at least 2 hours, you're fine.
Well, so what are the implications then for people who enjoy fasted workouts? Like people that, like me personally, I like to go to the gym on an empty stomach. I know that it ultimately comes down to personal preference, but I actually feel stronger and more energetic when I'm not digesting food and when it's the morning and I still have that like morning cortisol diurnal spike,
Sure. Yeah.
So I love working out fasted. And I was under the impression that because it's been, by the end of my workout, it has probably been something like 12 to 14 hours since my last meal.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it then appropriate to want to get protein as soon as the workout ends?
Yes. And I'm going to say yes, and then I'm going to add a bunch of crap to my answer. So the concept of the post-exercise anabolic window, we would rather have people look at it as more of like the peri-workout window. Mm-hmm. So the peri-workout or the peri-exercise time frame is basically the time frame between your pre-exercise protein administration and your post-exercise protein administration. And in the beginning, this only freaking counts if your main goal is muscle gain.
Okay.
That only counts to that. If your goal is to maintain muscle and it's not an extreme amount of muscle.
Well, I want to gain muscle. Help me get swole, Alan.
Okay. So here's the thing. You wouldn't necessarily want to stretch your peri-exercise period. So once again, the time period between the pre-exercise protein dose and the post-exercise protein dose, you wouldn't want to stretch it much further than 5-6 hours.
I'm definitely stretching it.
And you are definitely stretching it.
Yeah.
But here is the thing. Here's the thing. If we were to say, okay, let's pull out all the hypothetical stops and get you some protein pre-exercise and post-exercise. Yeah, we would be pulling out all the hypothetical stops, but the degree to which it would help your goals is questionable.
Interesting.
It might only be such a small amount that it might not even be worth the trouble.
Wow.
And not only that, but there is a 2010 study by Del DK and colleagues where they compared the post-exercise anabolic response to a mixed meal in fasted conditions versus fed conditions. And the anabolic response, they measured anabolic signaling molecules and possibly MPS too, but I think mainly just the anabolic signaling molecules. That was actually greater with the fasted meal. With the fasted training bout.
Wow.
Than it was with the fed training bout, because apparently the body freaks out and has a greater anabolic rebound when you train fasted versus when you train fed. Now, the reason why I'm not hanging on to that bit of research and saying, okay, well, anabolic rebound is stronger with fasted training, so you better fast your way through your workout, is because people differ widely, individually, in their capacity for training performance on fasted versus fed training. So if you're telling me that you feel freaking great training fasted and you can power through your thing even better than when you're fed, you feel better, and you can just power through it better and you can perform better, then I would say good.
Love it. Yeah, I don't know. I just the morning, the fasted workout for me is it's also probably a situation where if I don't do it early in the morning, it just becomes a lot more difficult to motivate myself midday. Um, but yeah, super interesting that I don't need to that ultimately it's splitting hairs.
It is. It is. And like I said, some people will be like, oh, no way I could go through my lifting bout fasted. I would just peter out during the last sets of every exercise and stuff. Okay, cool. Then, have a pre-workout meal. But yeah, those seem to be of secondary importance compared to getting total daily protein right. So with protein intake, there's definitely a 3-tiered importance level, a hierarchy of importance. So by far, the top tier would be getting your total daily protein in by the end of the day. And then distant second would be the distribution or the dosing scheme that would comprise that total daily amount. And then the third tier of importance for protein intake would be its timing relative to the training bout.
Got it. But by and large, the most important variable is the quantity of protein that you're getting on in a 24-hour period.
24-hour, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. As far as we know. Yep.
Got it. Okay, so control for protein. Make sure that your protein intake is high. Manipulate the fats and carbohydrates in accordance with your own preferences and needs with regard to athleticism.
Right. And people will bring up the kidney thing with protein. And if you have any concerns about chronic kidney disease, then see your doctor about that, because with that, the range of the RDA are 0.8 grams per kilo all the way up to 1.5-ish. 1.5 seems to be the cutoff for pushing it for protein intake with people who have concerns about chronic kidney disease. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there. If you have concerns, then keep your protein intake 1.5 or below grams per kilogram of body weight. So we're talking about let's say 0.6-ish grams per pound. Like the 0.4 to 0.6-ish grams per pound would apply to patients with chronic kidney disease. So we're mainly talking about athletic populations and people who are worried about incurring kidney issues with high protein diets. The evidence just isn't there to show that probability.
Got it. That's good to know. What are some, because I love that you, one of the things that you do on social media so well is you fight nutrition like myths and misinformation, which is so prevalent. You talk about that in your book as well. It's, the fact that we all eat, right? Yeah, everybody feels like an expert,
right.
Because it's just something that we all do, right? And the fact that anybody, well, I guess not anybody, but you don't have to have credentials in the field of nutrition to author a nutrition book. Look at me, right?
Well, you did awesome, man. I listened to your whole interview with Ed Milet, and you were killing it.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. Yeah. That means a lot coming from you, especially. But what are some of the more prevalent nutrition myths that you see come up again and again that we can hear on the Genius Life set the record straight on?
Oh man. Okay. I get pretty annoyed with the nitpicking of when to eat during the day.
So is this intermittent fasting?
Intermittent fasting. Man, we could talk about that for like an hour.
Let's talk about it.
Okay. There's different variants of intermittent fasting. There's time restricted feeding where you're eating within a constrained window within a day. There is alternate day fasting, which is self-explanatory. And there's whole day or consecutive day fasting. And there's stuff like the variants of whole day fasting, like the 5-2 model, where you're just fasting 2 days out of the week. Okay. The bulk of the positive result research kind of falls into time restricted feeding. And with the other variants, the whole day fasting, every other day fasting, 5-2, the long-term research does not show cardiometabolic benefit beyond the capability of those schemes to reduce body fat.
Got it.
The only special effects that we've seen thus far are in time-restricted feeding. And the special effects within time-restricted feeding tend to fall in the early time-restricted feeding range, where you start eating and you cut off basically you skip dinner.
Right.
Okay. I have issues. I have issues with universalizing the prescription for any of those models, because it is icing on the cake, and it's whatever the individual can adhere to on a permanent basis from here till you clock out of life is what you should be doing. For some people, it's just not realistic to skip dinner socially, and that can have psychological impacts.
Agreed.
That would cascade into physical detriment, and so it's just not realistic. There is a line of thinking. There's a group of folks who really want to push the universal prescription that, okay, we have to stop eating at X p.m. Just don't eat. We'll say we'll be kind of reasonable here. Okay, 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. Don't eat after that. Okay, and then they want to combine that just to make sure that the feeding window is 8 hours or less. They want to say, okay, don't eat for at least an hour after you wake up. So you have those two rules that you're adding to your life that are taken as non-negotiables. And they remove the potential for just individualizing according to personal preference. And that can jeopardize sustainability. And for the people who follow it and love it, okay, great. They've found a way to constrain their feeding window and eat less total by the end of the day. But for other folks, it is anywhere from unnecessary to a pain in the butt. And I'll also add this. In the scheme of people who are physically active, and who train at some point in the day, the theoretical benefits of time-restricted feeding pretty much go out the window. They pretty much disappear. And there is some interesting research on resistance trainees showing a fat loss benefit with time-restricted feeding. But that is largely because their opportunities to eat are short-circuited, which is a viable way to swing it, right? But yeah, the improvements in glucose control, for example, with early time-restricted feeding, they would, in all likelihood, for most populations, be negated by an exercise session. That happens, especially if really at any point in the day. The most significant physiological event in your day, the most high impact from just a physiology standpoint, would be the exercise training bout. And so somebody who will take, for example, somebody who thinks they need to just stop eating period at 7 p.m. Well, let's imagine they train after work. They are in prime time to maximally utilize ingested fuels after their late afternoon, early evening workout. And for them to just, stop eating or short circuit that, you're not necessarily matching the fuel with the activity, or the fuel with the recovery, or the fuel with the body's receptivity to nutrients and calories even. And so when you take training into account, time-restricted feeding models, early time-restricted feeding models are really kind of questionable as a you got to do this in order to be healthy type of prescription. So yeah, that kind of bothers me.
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that it's sometimes communicated as a non-negotiable. And that's, I think, where people get misled, right? Because they view this thing as sort of like a magic device or tool or something that they have to do. They don't have to do it. Nobody has to intermittent fast,
Mhm.
but um, but insofar as it can be helpful to moderate intake of food,
Mhm.
um, insofar as the early time restricted feeding modality can impart cardiometabolic benefit on people who are perhaps not exercising,
Mhm.
right? Um, I always thought it was very empowering to know that you might see a benefit to markers like your blood glucose and blood pressure, doing early time restricted eating. If you, for example, lived in a part of the world where you didn't have access to the best high quality food and you were unable to train, it's a modality that is kind of can be easily adopted by people, and can kind of safeguard against some of the potential ill effects of a poor diet or sedentary lifestyle.
Sure. And I would also grant you that a significant segment of the population has problematic nighttime eating. And so there have been ad libitum models. So ad libitum being unrestricted, eat as desired. Ad libitum experiments where you just stop eating at X time in the evening, early evening, but that's the only intervention put into place. And lo and behold, people spontaneously just eat less overall and they lose weight. And so for certain segments of the general population, it is a fine default intervention. But whether it is sustainable really kind of has to be looked at on a case by case.
Hmm.
And even if we were to nitpick and say, okay, maybe there really is something to early time restricted feeding where you're really front loading your calories, and you're really kind of tapering off towards the end of the day. There are issues that you can run into with older populations who really need to take every opportunity they can to meet their nutrient needs. And so if they're purposely, let's say, skipping breakfast or purposely skipping dinner, or heaven forbid both, then they're missing opportunities to feed. And that can be an issue when you're looking at protein in the elderly population. So, but elderly or not, let's say we look at the bro population that is trying to gain muscle, or just the general population trying to optimize cardiometabolic health and optimize their protein intake as one of the foundational tenets of achieving that. We can take the early time restricted feeding model, modify it, and say, sure, you can eat past that magic 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, or whatever. You can have a pre-bed meal, but make it a small meal, make it rich in protein, and then you've kind of won one.
Hmm.
So yeah,
So would you rather, you've got two choices. You can either stop eating at 8 p.m. or have a protein shake before bed. Would you have the protein shake before bed?
I would
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah,
All right.
yeah. Especially as somebody who's in physical training.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So protein before bed, has that been shown to help?
There's a lot of research showing various benefits
Wow.
of pre-bed protein.
Hmm.
And this is yet another nitpick because a lot of this research can't be disentangled from the idea of just optimizing total daily protein. There's not a whole lot of research comparing this magical little pre-bed protein hit with a control group that has the same amount of total protein, but it's just concentrated on other points of the day. But at least in theory, and Van Loon and Jorn Tromelin and their group at Maastricht, if I pronounce that right, they've done a lot of the good work on pre-bed protein feeding. And Mike Ormsby has a really great review paper on nighttime eating or pre-bed eating and sort of the new paradigms and the new focuses that we have on looking at nighttime eating being a bad thing versus using it as a weapon for good
Hmm.
when it's a smaller protein focused type of meal or even a snack, if you will. And it also, of course, justifies my pre-bed phage with buckets of honey
Is that
and berries and seeds.
so? For those who don't know, phage is I actually buy this stuff too. It's Greek yogurt.
Yeah.
Do you buy full fat, reduced fat, fat free?
You know, I do fat free and I see it as a marvel of technology. Milk fat is a special kind of fat in that it shows neutral to even beneficial effects. And this would be distinct from butter, where the milk fat globule membrane is turned out, and then you don't necessarily get those protective benefits with butter. But with the milk fat removed from phage, it's almost like this perfect. It's like this perfectly engineered protein snack.
It is, yeah.
Because you're economizing on calories.
Right.
I'm
with you. That's what I buy.
Yeah, you do
the pink little Faye. I don't know how to pronounce it, but yeah, I buy the 0% fat.
I'm so mispronouncing it. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so that's what I have pre-bed. And like I said, I'm probably taking a good thing and dumbing it down a little bit by dumping honey on it. But I dump honey on it and I pour a bunch of hemp seeds on it. My wife kind of introduced that to me, and I'm like, "Oh man, this is good." so yeah. There is the don't eat before bed thing really is a nitpick when you haven't necessarily covered your bases holistically or in totality.
Got it. But if you're trying to maximize muscle growth, definitely consider the pre-bed.
Definitely consider the pre-bed. And I want to say too that having a huge meal before bed is generally not a great thing for sleep quality. I mean, at minimum, you're taking in a lot of hydration, and then you could just have to get up and pee like mid-sleep cycle, and you're messing things up that way anyway. But you need to strike the right balance. Some people can go fine, like not eating anything 3-4 hours before they go to bed. Their goals might not warrant that extra meal or that extra protein-rich snack within 1 to 2 hours of sleeping. It might not warrant that. But then again, these are sort of nitpicks, sort of icing on the cake. And I don't like it when people take the icing on the cake and sit and give it a hard line and give it a hard prescription.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole point of flexible dieting and everything that I've seen, you put out, as well as your colleagues, like in the fitness space, that there's, I think there's a lot of dogma in the online wellness world. You either have to eat this way or the highway. That you either have to be on this hardcore carnivore or ketogenic diet or vegan diet.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to develop XYZ chronic disease, and your waistline is going to expand to the high heavens, and who knows what.
Yeah.
But the reality is, and at least what the science says, is that there's a lot more sort of leeway in terms of like what is going to work for your average person.
Humans are extraordinary organisms. We're extraordinary animals. Such a wide variety of diets and protocols lead to similar effects. The unifying principles that help us live long and help us live well are staying physically active and not eating too much overall, and having good social and psychological health. Everything else is kind of secondary to that, even getting enough protein. But yeah, it certainly helps.
Are you where do you stand on the carnivore diet?
Oh man. Okay. The carnivore people are such gentle and nice people, especially Sean Baker.
I love Sean.
Dude, Sean is the most gentlemanly gentleman ever.
Are you in love with his Instagram? I'm in love with his Instagram. his Instagram game is.
I've mentioned that I love his
level.
Instagram, and I got a certain amount of hate for telling people I laugh at his content because it is funny. But yeah. I met Sean by trying to troll him. Like, he was on a live, and then I said, "Hey, Sean, I just had a large order of fries. Do I need to call the paramedics or something like that?" And he just laughed it off, and he's all, ah. And I'm like, oh, this guy's pretty cool. He's pretty chill. He's mellow. He knows how to take a joke or two. And I think that Sean's non-aggressive approach to carnivore, like he says, just go as carnivore as you can, or as you want. Some people just eat just cow flesh and that's it. But if you want to add dairy, it's fine. He's kind of flexible. He's kind of flexible with his carnivoring. And I disagree with a lot of it, but I would agree that the carnivore diet, or just starting with beef, the beef base, let's say, at least observationally, is a good beginning template, a good baseline to figure out what foods kind of set off your intolerances.
Hmm.
And starting off with that kind of beef base, and then you add foods, plant foods, or
So
whatever
you're not
suspect.
anti-beef.
No.
I love hearing somebody who's so evidence-based come out in support of beef. It's great. It's a great thing.
For my 50th birthday, the main thing I wanted was just a huge steak. I'm like, I'm happy. Give me a steak. So yeah, I think that now there is evidence that an excessive consumption of red meat, fatty red meat, if you set it up under hypercaloric conditions, let's say, or maintaining suboptimal body composition, then you can incur certain clinical effects that are unfavorable over time. But, as a baseline for an elimination diet to find out what the offending foods might be that could be setting off whatever, your allergies, your intolerances, your autoimmune responses, I think that's fine. And I am aware of the major health agencies' guidelines on the limits of red meat. It's kind of small. It's like 2.5 ounces a day, or like roughly 18 ounces by the end of the week. In which case, I would much rather have an 18-ounce piece of steak rather than chinsing it through like 2.5 ounces a day.
Yeah, no way.
I don't know. I'm not totally sold on the make or break, with having more beef than that.
Yeah.
It really depends on the way you cook it. Depends on a lot of surrounding factors.
Yeah, context.
Depends on how lean or how fatty it is. Depends on the total amount of saturated fatty acids in the diet and how much, and what the sources of the SFAs are coming from. Just a whole bunch of factors swirling around that just make me a bit skeptical of the lowballing of the red meat recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said it's easy to find observational studies that link red meat to worse health outcomes because when you look at the population level, the people who are consuming more meat, they tend to smoke more, be more sedentary, adopt other unhealthy lifestyle behaviors. But there are no long-term randomized control trials that I'm aware of that have shown any negative health outcome with beef. But in fact, when you look at when you consider the fact that it's a pristine source of protein, it's one of the most nutrient dense foods that we have access to. To me, it seems like a food that you'd be almost negligent to not include. Now, I'm not saying that's all you should eat, but I think it definitely has a place within a sort of optimal diet.
Sure, and any time that you restrict a certain food or cut it out, there's going to be some kind of trade-off.
Yeah,
there's going to be some nutrients that you're just not going to be getting. Every food species is unique in its composition, its nutritive composition, and a big criticism of the carnivore diet would be, well, you're only having beef. You're missing out on a lot of the nutrition you could be getting from a wide range of, if you just want to keep it all animal, you're missing out on a lot of good stuff from the seafood to the land food and everything in between, So yeah, the extremes with the carnivore diet, I don't see it as an optimal long-termer. It's just not. The data are not there to support it as optimal for long term, but some people are just so fed up and so frustrated with trying to figure out what's messing with me, what's igniting these intolerances and stuff, that it's fine for a baseline elimination diet. But yeah, ultimately, if you want to optimize health, there are just too much data on a plethora of other foods that would bolster long-term health that you're having a high opportunity cost if you're avoiding them from your diet.
Fruits and vegetables.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Nuts, seeds, all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to ultra processed foods, I mean, that's something that we talk a lot about on this show. The fact that, I mean, the American diet, essentially, we're drowning in ultra processed foods, whether it's the foods or the ultra processed ingredients used to make those foods. Can they serve a role? Like where do they fit within this the flexible
They're
dieting?
they're a problem. Um, Generally speaking, they're problematic, and generally speaking, the public is not equipped to they're not equipped to survive them because they're ubiquitous, they're cheap, and people just they don't have the awareness to keep them to a low roar. But for folks in the first world like you and I, and folks who have done a bunch of reading like you and I, and hopefully folks who read our stuff, read my book, there's a way to fit them in. And as long as the majority of your diet is from whole and minimally refined foods, then at least observationally, 10 to 20% of your diet coming from the YOLO side of things, whether it's desserts, alcoholic beverages, or a mixture of the two, and even ultra processed foods, as long as that is kept to a low roar and the other 80 to 90% of your diet is wholesome, then arguably that is a more sustainable approach than trying to do 100% unprocessed all the time.
Because that would be too rigid, right?
That's right. That's right. And yeah, the data are there to support an allotment of indulgence foods or fun foods or YOLO foods. But if it goes to more than a low roar, then you start encountering problems. The hyperpalatability or the ease of overconsumption of certain foods is really kind of the downfall of the Western world's health. But also a rigid approach to dieting where you're trying to eliminate these things 100% can result in sabotage and binging and just a cycle of binge and restrict. So you have to be able to give yourself some leeway to go into have a little bit of rebellion and a little bit of fun food-wise. And there are a small handful of people who don't like those kinds of foods. Don't drink, don't eat deep fried stuff, don't eat dessert, none of that stuff. Don't even eat like semi innocuous refined stuff like bread. Don't even like it. Okay, fine. Eat like a Spartan and be happy. But for the majority of the population, you can allow 10 to 20% YOLO in the diet and be just fine. And as long as there is the preset knowledge that you are allowing these foods, and researchers call this planned hedonic deviation. Okay, so as long as it's in the plan, then you won't see it as a failure that will just set some people off into giving up completely and sabotaging their diet and hopping off the diet completely. So an example I like to give, it's kind of an extreme example, but The Rock's cheat meals.
I'm not familiar.
The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, will do like a stack of pancakes, or he'll do like a bunch of sushi rolls, like Western style sushi rolls. They're all creamed up and
oh yeah, with the sprinkling of tempura.
Oh yeah,
crap on top.
All that, yeah, that's that blasphemous stuff.
Yeah,
right. The this roll and the that roll. He'll do that once a week, and he'll call it his cheat meal. But the fact of the matter is that is a highly calculated and planned and anticipated meal. So it's not, you can't technically consider it a cheat. It is a planned hedonic deviation. And when you include planned hedonic deviations in the week, or even within the day, within the minority of calories for your day, like let's say 200 to 400 calories, of like whatever the hell, and the rest of your 2,000 calories is Spartan, then that is more sustainable for the majority of the population. And it's arguably more healthy from a psychological standpoint.
Yeah. Is that just another way of saying like the 90-10 rule?
90-10, 80-20, yes.
80-20, yeah.
Yes.
So what does that look like over the span of a day for you? Is that just like a cookie after dinner or something, or is it more substantial than that?
You really have to individualize this, because this is just with me. With me, my pleasure, my indulgence is a teaspoon of peanut butter, and I'll take one of those squares of Trader Joe's dark chocolate and just
Damn.
Stack it on top, boom. I am good. I'm not much of a desserty person, but you put chocolate and peanut butter together and you created a bit of magic.
On the day-to-day basis, are you mindful of your macros and calories? Like, are you tracking at this stage in the game, or you've developed a sort of intuitive compass about?
Yeah. The thing is, I did go through a boot camp period. Well, shoot, I got my undergrad in nutrition. I got my graduate degree in nutrition. So all you're doing is studying menu building. And all you end up doing is just memorizing the macronutrient gram values of every single freaking food on earth.
Yeah.
So it's just in my head, but I don't actively keep track of that. I don't actively account for it. What I do actively do is make sure that at least 3 to 4 points in the day, I have a substantial hit of protein. And so you already know kind of mentally that palm-sized piece of anything, meat, fish, poultry, is going to run you about 40 grams of protein. And so if I have 2 of those in the day, and I have 2 scoops of protein powder at some point, and then I have a serving of eggs and a serving of dairy, bam, there's my protein for the day.
Do you do the 2 scoops of protein together, or you do it like 1 scoop in the morning, 1 scoop at night?
If I were being honest, I'd probably do like 4 scoops of the course of the day.
4 scoops of protein.
Hell yeah, bro.
And what kind? Yeah. Hell yeah.
Well, here's the thing. In summer, I'm all about I love my shakes. I love the frozen shakes. Like I have this mocha frappuccino protein thingy I have in the morning. That's 2 scoops of protein powder, frozen bananas, ice, and coffee, and cold coffee. And I dump a bunch of unsweetened cocoa in there. And it's just, I just love it.
Sounds amazing.
It's amazing. It really is amazing. And in the afternoon, I'll have like a cup of frozen blueberries, a bunch of ice, non-fat milk, and then 2 scoops of chocolate protein powder, and then dump more unsweetened cocoa powder in there. And it's like this chocolatey blueberry-ish thing. I call it the Thanos shake, or I call it the superior shake. And I'll have 2. I've been having those 2 shakes a day. And so thus I've been having 4 scoops of whey protein a day for like the whole summer.
Wow. That's awesome. I'm going to up my whey intake.
And when you get 2 to 4 scoops of protein powder in during the day, getting the rest of the protein is really not much of a problem, logistically. So yeah. I do lean on protein powder because I will admit to you straight away that I do want to put on a few more pounds of muscle if I can. It's like a fun game for me.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Blood testing, which is available to most people through your primary or functional medicine doctor. But then for our athletes, we do spit testing, stool testing, sweat testing, et cetera. And that's how we drill down, because most of my clients are already the greatest, and I have to get them that little edge